Welcome to Olympian Method, everyone. My name is Sean.
Yeah, my name is Wolf, and I like the name, by the way. It suits us.
Yeah, and good job on the graphic design, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Well,
Wolf was asking me what colors to pick, and I'm like, well, is that red or green? And I'm colorblind, so probably not the best person to ask. You ask me about anything shape related, I'm totally good with that.
Yeah, and I'm not exactly a visual designer myself, so I just do what I can.
Right. Well, this is the number one rule on podcast. Always make sure your phone is off and silent.
Yeah.
So Wolf.
All right.
We had broke some pretty abstract and heavy ground last time.
For sure.
A lot of thought experiments that had to do with perception. Was reality defined by other people's perceptions or yours primarily? How do you give weight to each of those things?
Mm-hmm.
If somebody can perceive something that other people can't, but is able to be perceived scientifically through instruments. We covered a lot of abstract topics, but I want to bring it sort of down to a more base level for this episode.
Okay.
And I want to start it off with a question of, what do you define as strength?
Ooh,
and does it differ from power?
Okay.
That's two separate questions, but a first one, what is strength?
All right, let's unpack the first one first, right? So to me, there can be two different kinds of strength, and I'm not sure which one you mean, so maybe I'll talk about both here. So I think there's a physical form of strength, which is often equated with, say, your muscular ability is one way to measure it, or I mean, I'm sure there's other ways you could measure it, but that's what comes to my mind. And then so it's like your physique is a main component in that. And then there's the other form of strength, which is more of your mental strength. And that's measured in a lot of different ways, like your willpower, your toughness is a word sometimes people use for that, where you can persevere in certain circumstances that others cannot. And then your circumstances don't necessarily determine your mood, might be another strength. There's a lot of ways of measuring mental strength. So I think then the next question is about power, right?
Right.
And I think there's a lot of people who equate the physical form of strength with power, but I think that's not entirely true, because I think power is more about your ability to realize your will in the world. So to make the world like be the way that you would will it to be, or that you want it to be in your head. Does that make sense? And so you can use physical strength as an element of that if that strategy works for you, if you're in a society where that will give you an advantage over others and they will obey you as a result of your physical strength, although that could be very tenuous and make you into a dictator people don't like and you get overthrown. But I think that the second one is actually more important to me for power, which is the ability to build up strength in your mental facilities and to use those abilities to kind of make your will realized in the world.
Right. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is if you're mentally strong, you can apply that towards the gaining of physical strength.
Yes. And I mean, there's actually a lot of overlap between those two, because right, exactly as you're saying, once you're able to build up that willpower component of the non-physical strength, that gives you the ability to repeat something in the physical world, which will build up the physical strength as well. So I think that skill is actually even more important than just raw muscle power.
Right. Well, and I want to. Something I was thinking about in terms of strength, and that was a great answer, by the way. I love how you...
I was totally off the cuff, basically.
Man, the musician mind, the improvisation, it's kicking in.
Okay.
You were a jazz musician, right?
Yeah, I played in jazz band, like in high school was my first exposure to real jazz, I guess.
Right.
Bass player, by the way.
I mean, you sort of, did you, when you were learning music and you were first starting out, did you apply that sort of, did you have any like mental tricks that you used to kind of motivate yourself or to push yourself to learning the instrument further? Or, I mean, did you think about it in terms of power, or was it more just like, I can do this?
Yeah, I don't know if there was ever like a power component in my head, but it definitely did build up mental facilities, because the instrument I played was one of the few that like is almost entirely improvisational. Like you basically just get the chords that are in the various parts of the song, and then you kind of just have to make up a walking bass line that goes along with it for the most part, for large portions of it at least. And so I guess it really helps. You have to like fine tune some of your musical theory aspects more so than some of the others, because like really knowing your scales, really knowing how to get in and out of certain chords and notes and things like that. So you're doing a lot. It's almost like you're doing sort of like part writing from like the school. I'm getting too far into music theory here, but basically you're doing the work of like composing, basically like on the fly is what you're doing there when you're doing that style of improvisation.
Okay. But that is in an essence sort of taking your intention and manifesting it in the world. I mean, you don't really think about musicians as being powerful per se, like if they're talented. You just think of them as being competent, right?
You do if you attribute them as being rock stars, right? That's a certain form of power that's associated with, but it's not, the power is usually not associated with their musical ability per se. Mm-hmm. It's more associated with the influence they have, the following they have, the crowds of people who are interested in their music, and not necessarily because of the music itself, but it's often the personality behind.
Mm-hmm. Personality and maybe their stage presence. I mean, it's I actually wasn't planning on going down this road. It's just kind of naturally going there. But like when you think of big rock bands like Led Zeppelin, for example, you think of them as like powerful. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be lost on us that they used a lot of power chords. You know what I mean? Maybe there's something to it being called a power chord.
Could be.
But the reason why it's called a power chord is the root and the fifth is the strongest musical relation between two intervals in music, and it's also just in life in general. Like everything kind of resonates at the fifth degree, like whether it be a steel refrigerator or metal components in a room. If you resonate it, if you find its resonance frequency and then you play a fifth relative to that, it actually will make the object resonate, which is really interesting.
And I think we just lost half of our audience.
We did. But so back to I mentioned something else, competence.
Yes. So
how does strength, power, and competence differ in your mind?
Well, I think we talked about strength and power a little bit, right? So where does competence fit into the scheme of these things here? That's a tough one. So let me try and unpack this. So I guess competence is a related concept, right? Because it is about the ability to manifest a certain skill. But I think that there's a difference in that you could manifest your skill without it necessarily impacting the world or necessarily like changing like the way the world operates.
Right.
So to me, competence is more about your ability to like express that ability that you have. And it can, in certain societies, it can be attached with a certain amount of like, what would you call it? Like a social credit almost, or like you get a certain amount of street cred almost for competence in societies that are like meritocracies where they really value competence, but it's not a guarantee that because you are competent. So that would be an example of where you might gain power through competence, right? But it's not a guarantee that having competence will gain you power necessarily. I think the two can be related, but they're definitely separate.
Would you say that a measure that when you think of competence, you're really thinking about a very specific power dynamic, almost in a way?
Yeah, it's definitely more specific.
Right. Like perhaps you could think about it like you're a computer coder by trade.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be relatively how do I say it, agreeable to say that there are different levels of competence within your field. There are obviously people who are better at their job or are not as good at their job, and the same with anything, right?
Yeah, and there's also a large diversity of skill sets that are needed too across the field. So you could be very competent in one area or with one technology, for example, and not very competent with another, but it's really it's the sum total of all of your competencies that kind of make up that. So
it's almost, competency is almost it's sociologically reliant. It almost has nothing to do with the individual. Competence. Yeah, it's very contextual, right? Because I could be a very competent, like let's say programmer, right? But if for some reason all like programming goes away, if robots, AI replace all programming, and now it turns out that all we need are like farmers again for some reason, some society that happens in the future. Well, I'm pretty terrible at farming. Suddenly I'm not a very competent person. So it's very contextual to like what is the societal needs, right? Right. But I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I can think of an instance where farmers might need a computer programmer, and maybe an exchange of goods and services happens, right? Maybe. Right. Well, that's the thing. I mean, obviously, I think there's without getting too much into the economics of it and your own personal earnings, which I will not ask, but in general, usually computer engineers make a lot more money than the average farmer, right?
Right. And in general, there's much more growth within the like computer programming community than there is within the farming community. So there's more of us, and there's way more there. And the reason for that is that there's much more demand than there is supply of that type of labor.
That is true. So I have another question about strength. So we've kind of cracked the egg, so to speak, of this strength, power, competence dynamic. But when you think of an inanimate object, like just a physical object, and you try to think of its strength, like what do you like? If you think of steel, for example, what makes steel so strong? How can you define strength of steel in other terms?
Yeah. It's hard to define in a positive way. It's really hard to define in a positive way. It's easier to define in terms of what it's not. So, like, for example, one of the ways I think of steel as being strong is that is how difficult it is to bend, right?
Right. It's resistance to change.
Right. And when you think of strength, it's often very difficult to describe it in a positive way.
Mm-hmm. Well, for example, the Earth is probably the strongest physical thing that we have at our fingertips right now.
Right.
It's very difficult, if not impossible, to move the Earth.
Right.
And unless all 7 billion people jump at the same time, then I think you move the Earth like a nanometer or something like that.
Right.
But that'll never happen. But it makes me think of strength of Stoic philosophy, because you mentioned the ability to endure pain. It makes me think of Navy SEALs. Obviously, we've both read Jocko Willink, Extreme Ownership.
Yep.
If you were to ask the average audience, please feel free to participate. If you think of an individual or a group of people that you consider strong, I think of Navy SEALs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're almost the archetypical like strong-willed person at least in American society, I feel like.
Right, but they also are kind of a continuing legacy of like the Spartan warriors, the samurai.
Oh, for sure.
They've
been elite warriors over time. They just happen to have a particular relevance in our modern society.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting is you can say that obviously they're very physically powerful and they're also able to withstand a lot of pain and everything like that.
Sure.
But they're also very, very competent, and they're also very strong as well. They're very hard to move, right?
Right.
Now, the question I want to ask is that a good thing? Is it a good thing to be strong?
Well, then to answer that, we almost have to talk about what does it mean to be good, right?
Right. And
I don't know. Do we want to go down that rabbit hole right now?
Yes. Well, I think you were saying you were getting into some Friedrich Nietzsche a little bit, right?
Well, just a little bit. Yeah. I can't say I'm any expert on that.
Okay. Were you reading Beyond Good and Evil?
I haven't yet, but I've heard of that one. Yeah.
Mm. So I think what it means to be good is almost like asking what the meaning of life is. Because if you have to choose between looking at life as being completely against you and almost like created by a great deceiver, like Descartes would say, like, he had the thought of, what if the world is just created by a demon meant to deceive me? And it's like, I was thinking about it on the way over here, and that can lead to nihilism really, really quick. Like,
and we were talking about the problems with like radical skepticism, which was the basic premise that I talked about towards the second half of the last episode.
Right. I forget what number that was in your like your 4 possibilities of looking at the world and analyzing.
The first one was accepting skepticism and basically believing that nothing is important, like nothing matters and nothing is real or any of that.
Right. And obviously that's not very pragmatic. It's better to think of life itself as being good, and anything that furthers the existence of life as being good.
Right. But it's funny because we don't realize that we actually have thoughts in our head that we don't necessarily realize are paradoxical to that.
Right. And that brings me back to power and strength, because obviously if you have an individual who's power hungry and like a megalomaniac, egomaniac, anything like that, and they're in a position of, say, power, whether it be in a business or in a government structure, it can very quickly deteriorate. We've seen that happen throughout history.
Oh, for sure.
So,
I mean, especially in the last century, right?
The 20th century was awful. I mean, you had Hitler, you had Stalin, you had Pol Pot. I mean, basically no country has been without its sort of, how do I say it? It's demagogue or it's dictator. Yeah. Essentially. So my question is, how do you know if a competency hierarchy has become corrupt?
Well,
and it's okay to not know. I mean,
I guess it would be tough. It's tough for me to answer that, but I taking a grasp at it, I think you could look at. It depends on how you define corruption, but I think you can talk
corrupted
about
by power, I should say.
Okay.
So power outside of the competence range.
So, outside. Interesting.
So let's say like an example, someone gets a promotion in the computer coding field.
Yeah.
When they're less competent at somebody else, but maybe they're more physically strong, or they're better looking, or maybe they're like manipulative to the boss or something like that, verbally manipulative.
Yeah. So this is very difficult to measure, but I mean, let me give you a utilitarian answer, which is one that comes to mind, which is like whether the power, what did you call it? The social hierarchy or something like that?
The competence hierarchy.
The competence hierarchy. If the competence hierarchy is working to the benefit of the, let's just say majority or some, most of, if not all of those participating in it. That's very difficult to measure, but that's one way you could utilize whether it's corrupted or not, right?
Right. So whether there's a sort of a flow of mutual benefit happening, an economy almost within.
Right. Well, I guess maybe there's a step before that, which is, first of all, is it sustainable, right? Does it actually have a fundamental flaw that's going to collapse in on itself? And we've seen societies like that,
right,
that have not lasted very long.
Well, I can think of an example, right? So let's say there was a martial arts dojo that basically allowed people to fight for the death, even white belts. That would be a problem because all the white belts would get killed off by the black belts really quickly, and then you'd have no more students to learn.
Sure.
No one to teach.
It's been socially acceptable to fight, to resolve situations through duels until not that long ago, if you think about the grand scheme of things, right?
Yeah. Actually, one of my friends back from Indiana, who I think I've mentioned, one of the things he mentioned in his last podcast that I did with him was, he was asked the question by his wife, if there was one rule that you could change about society, what would it be? And he said it would be that, men could resolve conflicts by duels, or anybody could resolve conflicts by duels. And actually in Washington, side note, this is completely tangent, in Washington state, there's a mutual combat clause in the law. So two people can actually agree to physical combat and not suffer any legal consequences from it, as long as it's mutually agreed upon.
Interesting.
So back to the power dynamic.
So that actually gets back to the first definition of power, which is just, basically who's stronger than the other person wins. And that's kind of, I think, where we started as a society, but that's kind of what we see as uncivilized given the social norms of today.
Right. Well, you can think it's certainly, I'm going to be relativistic here.
Okay.
You could say that it's a lot less socially faux pas for a man to fight a man than it is for a man to fight a woman.
There's a certain social connotation to that.
Yeah. But what's interesting, so one of my primary sources for today, the reason why I bring up power, competency, and strength is, you've been reading Jordan Peterson's book or listening to it. Right?
I've listened to some of it. Yes.
He talks a lot about the concepts of power dynamics, but in relation to competency, et cetera, and everything like that. So my question is, do you think that, if there was a sort of allowance of, how do I say it, a measured physical conflict between individuals, that society would actually benefit from that?
It's difficult to say whether it would be a net benefit on society per se. You could probably imagine there might be some benefits from that, because it's difficult to say how that would affect our modern culture, because my only my best points of reference are sort of more historical at this point in terms of what societies that created. So it's an interesting question about how that would work in our modern society.
Right. Well, because as it seems that when people's ability to communicate breaks down, the only thing that's left is really no other word for it but violence. And there are different levels of violence.
Right. And up until recently, and you could even say implicitly today still, that when you analyze power, there's a theory. I don't actually subscribe to this so much myself, but there's a theory that as you unpack the raw elements or even the motivations behind power, eventually you'll get down to there's a threat of violence or a threat of use of force somewhere, because it usually ends up getting down to the police, the state somewhere will enforce it with violence if necessary, or by taking away your freedom, throwing you in jail. There's some threat of some nature of physical force ultimately at the end of it, right?
And that's true. And that's one of the benefits, I think, of Western society, is that we've outsourced the need for resolution of violent conflict,
right? But
to the
I think
state.
as we've abstracted on top of that, that's where we've become more and more civilized, where we can resolve well before getting to the point of needing to use that physical force, right?
Right. And, when you think of strength and power and competency, obviously you think of leaders, right? And
Sure.
Extreme ownership is a big part of that.
Mm-hmm.
So back to the whole essence of conflict, we've both studied, I'd say, Jordan Peterson a little bit. He's had some commentary on other animal species and how they deal with power dynamics.
We're going to talk about lobsters, aren't we?
Lobsters, rats, and chimpanzees.
Okay, which you want to do? Which you want to take?
You said that what really stuck out to you from one of his lectures was the study from Yang Pengsept, the rats, the rat study, measuring how they play.
Yeah, I remember that.
So do you want to elaborate on that? Do you think there's some wisdom in that can be reflective of human nature, perhaps?
Well, I don't remember the whole thing, but the part about it I remember is that rats when they play, when they pair off against each other, obviously, typically the more the one that's bigger, stronger will end up winning, right?
Right.
And then the weaker one will usually have to ask the stronger one to initiate play in the after that. And what's interesting is, if I remember correctly, that the weaker rat won't want to keep playing unless they win, what is it, 30%, I think, of the time?
30% of the time.
So they have to feel like they're playing a fair game, which I guess that's the minimum threshold. You have to win enough of the time that you feel like you actually have a chance at the game, right?
And that's why we have weight classes in the UFC.
I don't think rats have weight classes.
No, they don't. Well, that was another side note on the method of the study. I think they had one rat be 15% larger than the other one to guarantee that one rat could always win. That was what was needed to ensure 100% victory.
Okay.
But what they found was that the rats actually let the big rat let the little rat win about 30% of the time.
That is interesting.
Because if the game stops being played, then everyone ceases to benefit.
Right. And so what's interesting is when you relate that back to humans, you might think that's totally unrelated, but when you think about it, life for us is really just a series of games that we play by whatever rules we agree to, right?
Right.
And I think the way that we form those rules is around what we consider fairness. And some notion of that fairness is the way that we guarantee that it's not just pure physical strength that's going to guarantee that certain individuals win, right?
Right. Well, obviously your ability to deadlift has no merit as far as your ability to play chess or win a spelling bee.
Well, yeah.
Right. And there's no way for that to be a confounding variable. I'm not sure exactly where I was going with that, but it just kind of...
Yeah, I mean, we don't usually organize our societies around either of those things, but...
No, we don't. So, okay. So, reading through Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, he has a couple of rules that I feel like have... Let's just say they coalesce really well in my mind. One of them was Rule 2, which was treat yourself as if you're somebody that you're responsible for taking care of. And the other one was Rule 5.
By the way, that kind of reminds me of the, I'm not sure how they say this, but it's been a long time since I've been in an airplane. But the last time I was in, I think they said something about when the masks, descend from overhead, secure your mask before helping others.
Right.
Kind of reminds me of that.
Well, I think there is,
and it's also an element of the golden rule, right? About treating others the way you would be treated.
The golden rule. I mean, you can pretty much break down almost all moral philosophy down to that. It kind of covers all the bases. It's basically the checkmate. Once you, I mean, I'm actually glad you brought up golden rule because I think it simplifies everything. You have all of these crazy dynamics in society. You have people competing, but you also have people cooperating.
Right.
But it's treating other people the way you want to be treated. And it's well, I wouldn't want somebody to, I would think at first, instinctually, I wouldn't want someone to say, kick my butt in jiu-jitsu right off the bat.
Yeah.
There's no benefit for me. But if I knew that was going to help me learn, I would want somebody to beat me in jiu-jitsu. I wouldn't want somebody to tap me out or put me in an armbar.
That I think that gets into the notion of, I don't know, maybe we should change topics here. I'm not sure where you're going with this, but I was going to just add to that the notion of the ability to recognize that sacrificing something in the present will give you benefits in the future. And there's many ways that we've discovered that. And one of those is through, like you're saying, like training and things like that.
Yeah. Which I guess you could say is a measure of strength. Are you willing to forsake the now, a little bit of the now, endure a little bit of pain now for the future self?
I think that's the most important aspect of willpower, is that ability to make sacrifices that will benefit you in the long run.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, and treating yourself as if you're somebody that you're responsible for. It's almost like, I like to think of it as you're making a deal with your future self.
Yeah.
You know,
but future me, what has that guy ever done for me?
Dude, he's helping you out right now, just as much as your past self is. My mind was still a little turned around from our time travel discussion last time. I was a little bit, a little bit rattled. But here's another measure of strength, though: stoicism.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's why I kind of brought up steel. You know, when you think of the steel man argument, you try to make your opponent's argument seem as strong as possible, right?
Right.
But in stoicism, it's founded primarily on not being reactive. I've been started to read The Obstacles Away, by the way. Thank you for recommending that book to me.
Very good introduction. Yeah.
It talks about Rockefeller and how when during there was an oil crisis where everyone was speculating, and you know, kind of the equivalent of like the Wall Street mayhem that you're seeing nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he kept a cool head and, you know, didn't go with certain investors and made the logical decision, and he ended up being one of the richest men in the world as a result.
Right.
So I suppose we've kind of briefly mentioned extreme ownership, 12 rules for life, and obstacles the way, and stoicism.
None of which we are affiliated with, right?
None of which we're affiliated with. This is not a paid for or sponsored podcast. No, we just like these books. But what struck me, and the reason why I've been kind of setting all of this up, I've been kind of moving these little pawns on the chessboard into position here during this podcast, is, you know, I've heard people review these books and say, oh yeah, you know, they're a good read, it makes sense. But I haven't heard too many people talk about their experiences with how these books have directly impacted them or how they've inspired change. So have you had any, how do I say it, inspiration from these books that have led to changes in behavior?
Yeah. Let's see how deep we want to go here. I think from my own personal experience, the biggest has been, let's just say, you know, I've been through a situation that a lot of the rest of the world has been through, where I've had to be in isolation for close to a year now. I think it's been.
That sounds awful. Wait, you had to go through this?
Well, yeah. I mean, I know
I'm being sarcastic, guys.
I know a bunch of people who have, but mine was like one of the more acute cases. So for me, what happened was early on during this experience, I really underestimated myself, I guess is what I could say. Since I'm traditionally, I guess I'm kind of an ambivert, you know, kind of a little bit of introvert and extrovert. So I figured, I'll just swing towards introvert. I'll just enjoy being by myself, you know, for a while, right? Mm-hmm. But there's problems with that. So that works well, and this goes back to control. That works well when you have like control and power over like when you have social experiences, right? Because it gives you the ability to unwind when you are kind of overloaded from those experiences. But we all are social creatures. We all have some need for that. It's just everyone has different styles that they like to sort of realize that need in, right? Right. And sorry, were you gonna say something?
And on a side note, I actually prefer one-on-one conversations the most as a form of social interaction. But continue.
Okay, yeah. For me, it depends on several factors. But anyways, so I figured, well, you know, I'll just enjoy being by myself, and that didn't work out so well. So basically, what happens with that is yeah, this might get a little bit tough for me to go into too much detail on, but
I'll take over. So okay. I think everyone can relate to the feeling that isolation brings.
Yeah.
And I just recently got over having to do a 14-day quarantine, and I was just starting to do jujitsu. I was starting to do all of these things, like coming out of my shell again, you know. And I was like, I moved back to my apartment. Mm-hmm. So you know, throughout the whole quarantine, I was living with my folks, though. So I never really got the sort of isolation.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned 14 days because it was the first 2 weeks that were really the toughest for me, I think.
Yeah.
Because it was a combination of not I guess that the problem was not only the factor of me being alone by myself with my own thoughts, which is kind of already like dangerous enough as it is, but it was also the additional like almost paranoia that came down on me from the circumstances that caused the isolation that made me fearful to even go outside to experience the world, to interact with anyone else.
Right.
So the combination of those two things can lead to some very dark places is what I'm trying to get at here.
Where you really desire to want to see other people, but you also, you don't want to catch anything or give anything to anybody else, so to speak.
Yeah. So it took me about 2 weeks. And so the problem, the manifestation or kind of the symptoms of that for me ended up being like basically a loss of like structure and order in my life to a large degree. And I ended up having like virtually no sleep schedule. It's kind of like in and out of a fog of consciousness throughout much of those 2 weeks.
Oh, you're describing my last 2 weeks, man.
Oh, and because during that time I was still working, but my hours were not set. And because I wasn't going into an office and I was doing all my work from home, that meant that I had almost no structure enforced upon me. And so that just led to even like more of a downward spiral in terms of me not sticking to a very rigorous schedule. At first I thought the freedom was going to be great, right? But I didn't realize that like that freedom was also paired with like all of this, it came along with all this baggage, right?
Right. Did you clean your room?
I'm gonna say I did. I definitely let things get into disorder for quite a bit during those 2 weeks, and it took me about that long to like. I definitely didn't hit any form of rock bottom like some people have. There was definitely some form of depression during there for sure. But I didn't hit like the lows that I know some people have experienced. But I hit enough of a low that I built the strength and willpower, and we can talk about how that happened. This is a lot of, because I've been studying Stoicism, but I hadn't really been applying it to my life too much until this point, to be honest with you. And so that was the point where I basically realized that I had to start by enforcing like structure in my life again. And it started with like going to sleep and waking up at a relatively consistent time, and even like putting on the same clothes that I would normally wear like during the workday, picking a spot that was like designated for work and not just like working from anywhere in my apartment. And then it started to finally like fall into place.
Right. That's a beautiful story, man.
I have a blog post that goes into some of the details of this, by the way. Maybe we can link it if it helps.
Absolutely. Please. We'll link it in the description to the podcast for Spotify and YouTube for everyone listening. Great story, man. I can really relate to that. And thank you, by the way, for showing me obstacles away. That was actually a really I think it was the final piece of the puzzle for me in many ways. Because, when I was doing the 2 weeks, I sort of disappeared into a similar disarray that you did. Yeah. But the way I coped with that is I basically disappeared into music for 8 hours a day.
Yeah, for some reason. The funny thing about that is I didn't reach for music at that time. For some reason, that part of me just wasn't interested, even though normally in other circumstances I would be so interested in music.
I think part of what I realized what I was searching for was I was seeking to not be alone, because with the energy that was around me, I like creating the music almost it feels like an entity in its own sometimes. Right. And
the struggle for me, once I realized that ultimately like I wasn't, it was actually several different phases kind of, right? Because at first it was like, I thought I deceived myself to think, oh, I'm okay being alone. I quickly realized, no, I'm not okay being alone. And then at that point I thought, then I was like, I want to be with people. Then I went through a different phase, which is like, I'm afraid to be with other people. This is because of the circumstances of why I'm isolated at the time. And then there's like an acceptance at the end, which is almost, like the stages of grieving or whatever, where it's like, finally you have to actually accept that you're okay with being alone.
Yeah.
That's the hardest part.
It really is. And I think there is a difference between being alone and being lonely.
Yes.
But back to rule 2, where, treat yourself as if you're somebody that you're responsible for. It's almost like there's two selves in the mind when you think about it that way. And what I realized is I was sort of hiding from, I guess you could say it, my don't want to call it my tyrannical self, but the side of myself that plans and everything like that. I was hiding from that. I was hiding from myself. I realized that what I was really afraid of was being alone, was being alone with myself, like having the thoughts that I might have, like what I might know about myself. Because what's so interesting is when you're completely alone, you don't know other people, but when you're around people all the time, it kind of does prevent you from knowing about yourself to a deeper degree.
Yeah, and I think it's especially true in like our modern society. If you're very connected, well, you feel like you're very connected on things like social media, where you're just getting bombarded with updates and people's lives and things like that. And so you think you're connected. It's a very artificial and superficial type of connection. But what's even worse than that is because your mind is being bombarded with all these ideas, it's very rarely actually still enough for you to contemplate, meditate, whatever you want to, to think thoughts that are truly, genuinely your own.
Right. And the biggest struggle for me was actually learning how to meditate throughout this entire pandemic. I think I'd mentioned the Art of Living Foundation. I've had multiple, the teacher has been so kind in reaching out to me being like, "Where'd you go, Sean? We haven't seen you in a while." And I told her, I just haven't been able to meditate recently. It's been hard for me to sit and be with myself. And I think our society in general has gotten so used to interfacing with whether it be technology or social media or even other people in person. You know, it's the one thing that we've always had ourselves is finally we have to spend so much time with that person in a way. And we have to try to get to know ourselves as if we are alone. And that's...
and what's funny about that is you don't realize how painful and like I guess because the thing is like you know yourself and you know all of your own faults, especially you know the ways that you fall short of like your own standards, right?
Well, what did you say before we did the podcast? You know, who needs enemies when you have yourself as a friend?
Who needs friends? Enemies with with friends like yourself? Who needs enemies? Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Right. So what I'm getting at with that is that you can sort of push those things to the back of your mind if you've got other people's thoughts in your head, right? It's like a poor substitute for not needing to think any of the dark thoughts that are actually going on inside your head. And like push them down kind of subconscious level, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
But the thing is, once you take all those other things out, that's the stuff that rises right to the top.
Well, gosh, I mean, I don't know what you would call those thoughts. I don't know how you'd categorize it, but I think it's, I am kind of at a loss for words right now. I mean, because going back to that time when I was isolating, it was like I didn't have to think. You know, my brain's going back there, and I think that's why I'm at a loss for words. It's like I didn't have to like say anything to anybody, but I could hear my thoughts in my head. They were so loud, and I had a journal that I had written maybe 15 pages in the course of a year, and during the pandemic, I almost filled it up completely. Nice. So it's had tons of thoughts, but. So this goes back to the obstacles the way, you know, many, the extreme ownership philosophy, you know, Peterson talks about this a lot, and obstacles the way Stoic philosophy, it all kind of serves the same purpose. There's so much overlap, and they have a core central message, which is that you are responsible for yourself. Right.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of ways you can think about Stoic philosophy, because it's kind of like a whole, it's an entire way of thinking and like a mindset, and even like sort of like a paradigm for life in a way. So it's actually kind of hard to boil it all down to like something that you can convey in like a short soundbite. But the closest I've ever seen is actually a variation on, I think you might know this from recovery programs, is the Serenity Prayer. And so correct me if I'm wrong, because I might be misremembering this, but it's grant me wisdom to sorry strength.
So they say, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change.
Yes.
The wisdom to
accept the things I cannot change.
The courage to change the things I can.
And then the wisdom to know the
difference.
Yes. Okay. So so starting from that, it's a big part of basically knowing what things are under your control and not caring about the things that aren't under your control. And what's unique about Stoic philosophy, or what kind of takes it to the next level, is that you kind of have to you start to buy into the notion that like the only things that are in your control are like within you, and basically the entire external world is not within your control, and you have to sort of let go of it in a large part.
Well, in many ways, you can, It's a crazy thought experiment. So imagine this. Imagine you are responsible for all the world's problems. Like everything, no, literally, like just through some random metaphysical event, you, Wolf, or if you speaking to me, Sean, are responsible for everything, good and bad in the world.
I mean, so you're like God in a way, right?
It's a God thought experiment. So,
Yeah.
but tying in, it's a metaphysical experiment tied in with extreme ownership.
Yeah.
Right. So it's
Right.
like if you were responsible for all the world's problems, you know, what is the smallest thing that you could do to make it a little bit better?
Mm. Make it better, like for everyone or for yourself,
for everyone. But I mean, like standing, like it can be as simple as walking around with your shoulders back straight and standing up tall. You know,
right?
You know, petting a cat when you see one on the street.
Right.
You know, making friends with people who want the best for you, and also being friends with people whom you want the best for. I think, you know, it's
treating yourself like someone you'd take care of.
Exactly, and cleaning your room.
Exactly.
Extreme ownership. It's, you know, the podcast. The theme of this podcast was really just kind of about personal experience, you know, and learning from people's experience, like listening. And, you know, when I listen to you, I hear a lot of my story, and I hope that when I speak, you hear some of mine. And, you know, there's a lot of wisdom in books like this, but it doesn't mean anything unless you put it into practice.
And so one of the things I wanted to like sort of connect back to my experiences there and sort of my opinion of how Stoic philosophy sort of is built as a system. A lot of it too is around your value judgment. And so there's a quote by Shakespeare that I like to sort of explain this, which is, you know, neither good nor bad thinking makes it so. And it is so true. And to me, this is like the most important part of extreme ownership and also of the whole Stoic philosophy. It's like the world just is as it is. And so the ownership you take is not necessarily over the world being as it is, because obviously you're not omnipotent. But what you do have power over is the interpretation of whether it's good or bad, right? And there's you might say there's quotes from Jocko about just responding that everything is just good. I knew we were going to do that.
I know. I saw it coming a mile away.
But I mean, it's so true though, because there's so much, and we talked about this in the last episode about perspective and perception, and just so much of how you perceive the world is filtered and influenced by your own views, and it's not necessarily corresponding to the real world. It's the value and the meaning that you give to it.
Right. Like you could think about it like, oh my God, I'm hallucinating. Good. There's meaning to be had in that.
Right.
You know, that's an opportunity to grow. Or you could think about it, I'm seeing something that's actually there. Well, good. Maybe you can use it to your advantage. You know, you know, you let's say you think there's a huge problem. Like there's so many people on social media who think there are so many problems in the world, and maybe half the time they're real, half the time they're not. I don't know. But it's like a pragmatic thing, regardless of who it is. Good. There's a problem. What's the way to fix it? And being open to solutions. I think the whole idea of good is it immediately opens you up to the possibility of finding solutions. Because if you say bad, you know, you're like, it's like,
yeah. Well, it's also like, you know, if the world, if everything's not your fault in like some manner, if you don't play at least a part in that, if it's all just the universe is the way it is, then there's no way for you to fix it, right? So that's the problem with that mentality. And so that's why, yeah, it's a little extreme to go all the way to the other end of like, you know, you own everything, like everything is within your control, or at least everything is like part of your value system of whether, you know, it being good or not. But the alternative just is, it takes away all your power. And I think it's better for us to think of the world in a way in which we have that free agency.
Right. And I think where Jocko and Peterson overlap too, is they really want their readers to have power over themselves.
Yes.
You know, and not like in a tyrannical way. Jordan Peterson talks about that explicitly. Like you don't want to like be a tyrant with yourself and like put yourself down for not doing the things that you're supposed to do.
Right.
Because that just creates a negative feedback loop of thoughts. It's how depression starts. It's how anxiety starts.
Been there.
Been there too. Still in it sometimes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's all about really being kind and accepting. We kind of talked about that a little bit last episode. The whole theme of acceptance. But yeah, you know,
But yeah, I think we're taking it to like a whole nother level now.
Yeah. So back to the thought experiment of God, it's like, you know, if I was God right now and I was responsible for all the pain and suffering in the world, like what would be one thing that I could do better right now?
Right.
The first thing I can think of is don't lie.
Yeah.
Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Because it's so hard to tell the truth, because that philosophical question of what is the truth is
the problem with reducing that to just don't lie is that still leaves the possibility of withholding the truth, right?
Like secrets.
Yeah.
You know, I wrote in my journal once that it's so interesting when you think about the idea of trust, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like say I tell you something that I don't want anyone else to know,
which
I wouldn't do on this podcast,
except the whole listeners.
But if I entrust something to you and be like, hey, you know, don't tell this to anybody else, kind of thing, you know.
Yeah, we can trust you, right?
But here's the thing: that element of trust is based on you keeping a secret from everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, but if you tell the truth of what I've told you to other people, in a way, that's deceiving me.
Right.
So it's almost like...
So that gets back to the much earlier question you had asked about corruption and like whether competency hierarchies are corrupt or not. And part of that too is whether it's like beneficial to the overall group, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways that manifests itself is by trust.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because if the different actors or different characters or, you know, players in that game, if they don't trust each other, you're not going to build up a very successful society over that.
Right, because if nobody can trust each other, that just leads people to behaving as if it's a state of nature.
Right.
And seeing life as brutish and short, and a competition between all individuals at all times. Right. You know, so it's good to tell the truth. Well, and I think it's a simple truth. Whenever I think sometimes we can forget the truth sometimes. So an exercise, this is more just kind of a exercise I like to do, but whenever I'm writing and I'm kind of figuring out, man, what's going on in the world? I'll start with a simple truth. Like, I'm here in my room, you know, I'm sitting down, the sun is out, I'm breathing oxygen, you know, and it's that creates its own positive feedback loop. I start with these small, simple truths. And if I keep writing, eventually I get to some sort of insight that seems like it could be truthful. Yeah, that is not so mundane and innocuous.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of reminds me of what you talked about in the last episode about having like a mantra that you start from, that you sort of repeat. And then I wonder if obviously I don't want you to share any like, you know, spiritual secrets here, but if there's anything to the process of sort of how you go from that to building up like, you know, more like higher levels of thinking.
Well, and I think this goes back to religious dogma, or how religious ideas become dogmatic is, you know, these like the Lord's Prayer in Christian tradition.
Right.
I don't know any prayers in the Islamic tradition, but I'm sure I could look them up. But when you repeat these mantras and you develop a pattern around them, and then you see all of life happen before and after those mantras, if you make that the pinnacle of your transcendent experience, to experience those, to just say those mantras and bring them into being, and then all of reality happens around that, it becomes very difficult for your mind to dissociate what's happening around you from the mantra itself. We're very bad at determining causality. We can see correlations.
Yes.
We can see that the sun has been rising every single day since the day that we were born. But, you know, at the same time, that's based on our experience. I was actually thinking on the way here. Yeah. We know there's 7 billion people in the world, right? But have you ever seen 7 billion people?
Yeah, I was going to say, do we actually know that?
Yeah, that was one of the things. But it gets back to another point.
It's more like we know that there are, well, I mean, I know, at least, you probably have similar experiences. We know that there can be large crowds of people in certain populated areas. And we visited, there's, you know, multiple populated areas, and we've kind of abstracted from that the vastness of like the population of the earth, right? But we don't ever actually experience that.
Right. And if we do, it's usually through the internet and social media. And it's a very diluted and derivative form of relating to people. But I mean, I just kind of lost my train of thought there for a moment, but it just kind of goes to show is it's like it is important to base your idea of truth off of what you can perceive first and foremost. I think that's the kind of the crux of what I'm getting at here.
Yeah, well, I mean, to some degree, that's to start out, that's all we have initially, right? Until we build up any levels of abstraction that are higher than that.
Right, like a mathematical formula or or a doctrine or something like that. But back to your point about the spiritual phenomena, where it's like, yeah, it's a repeatable thing that everything kind of follows. You know, it does help. I've started getting back into it in the past. Actually, just last night, I tried doing the mantra, and it did help. But they do say you have to keep doing it over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's actually something that's beneficial about religion, is it does give people a sort of a central point with which their lives revolve around. It gives them a point of consistency, of absoluteness, you know?
Yeah. And it also, it helps to provide a framework for that notion of being willing to sacrifice, right, in the now for the benefit in the future. That's kind of like the ultimate expression of that sort of, that narrative, if you will, is built into the religion. So I think that one of the reasons that's given rise to it and why it still maintains its popularity to this day is its usefulness in sort of ingraining that into our culture.
Right.
And I think there's certain parts of society that have found other ways to sort of gain that same knowledge. There's other narratives that people have used to get that. And so there are groups that are less religious, but still believe in that narrative today. And so we're seeing an interesting, in some ways, a transition period. We're going to see, probably not within our lifetimes, but, you know, generations down from us will see whether that religious aspect morphs into something else over time in different societies, or if it continues to exist as it does.
Right. Well, I think what we structure our beliefs around is changing, has changed, and I think it will continue to change. And
yeah,
you know, Socrates always said that philosophy was the practicing of death.
That was, I hadn't mentioned this yet, but another, you know, if you take kind of the acceptance aspect of Stoic philosophy, the ultimate expression of that is the acceptance of your own mortality, your own, you know, short time on this planet. And from that, you can either take that to mean that, you know, your life is kind of pointless because it's short, or you can take the extreme opposite view, which is we only have a short amount of time. We better use it to the absolute fullest, right?
Yeah, we better GTFO on with our lives. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, the proper approach to Stoic philosophy is the latter, but I think that, you know, if you're inclined for the more nihilistic approach, you might, you know, trend towards the former, which is unfortunate.
Right. I mean, it's interesting. If you feel like life is meaningless, do you feel it actually kind of makes you more self-conscious of your own survival in a way? No.
But if it's meaningless, I don't see where do you get the drive to survive?
Yeah, exactly. I guess I was thinking more not nihilism, hedonism.
Oh, yeah,
which is, I think, a form of nihilism, that there's only pleasure.
There's some related parts to it, but yeah, the Stoics and the hedonists didn't see eye to eye exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I mentioned this book last time, The Immortality Key. But there's the idea that the transcendence out of the mortal realm, basically re-entering the Garden of Eden, is akin to realizing to not being afraid of death anymore. Mm-hmm. How much time do we have?
About 7.
Okay, realizing that. Or realizing that death has no consequence, that there is no end. Yeah. Pardon me. So when you live as if death is impossible, there's a book called Einstein's Dreams that outlines 2 possibilities where if people thought they would live forever, they would just do nothing and be lazy, or they would see themselves as having infinity to accomplish everything. Now here's the thing, like our physical bodies definitely die. There's no qualm about that. But we do influence everyone around us in what we do. And I think that's what gives life meaning, is how much impact we have on other lives.
Right. And it's like we don't all start from square one, because if every new generation like started completely from scratch and had to relearn everything, like we would never make any progress, right?
Exactly. And I think that's why it's impossible to have equal outcomes, because no one does have an equal beginning. Even if you're trying to control for that through various methods, it's just not possible. Like I think it's important to be grateful for what we have and what we do have, but acknowledging that the struggles that are placed in front of us are meant to help us grow.
Yeah, it's that whole, the obstacle is the way, what was the obstacle becomes the way sort of mentality there.
Right. Do you think that there are a lot of people who are in their own obstacle and therefore their own way?
Could you elaborate on that scenario? I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, I meant like obviously with the whole situation that the whole world's been in, where we've had to isolate. Some people have been maybe trying to escape from themselves or realize that they were living in a cycle of escaping from themselves.
I think people have learned a lot about themselves they may not have known before. I mean, I know I certainly did as a result of that.
Yeah, me too, man.
Yeah, and so I mean, in my case, it's been kind of a growing, because again, back to the whole Stoic philosophy. At first it seems like, you feel like trapped at home, and you feel like so bored, and you feel like, and the biggest problem is when you don't know when it's going to end.
Right.
Because it's easier to persevere when there's an end in sight.
Right. You have like a plan.
Yeah. Because then you can plan for the future. But when you can't even plan for the future, that was the experience for me that kind of led to the darkest depths in a lot of ways. Yeah. And so once you finally like sort of take a step back and evaluate that aspect of your life, and you realize that actually like there's so many good things about my circumstance that I'm not even seeing. Like I've got all this extra time on my hands. I've got all this extra flexibility, and I've got like all these skills that I could be utilizing that I'm not. Right. And so you start realizing, hey, there's actually like all this good in my life that is being uncovered by this that I didn't even know.
Right. Now, do you think there's such a thing as toxic positivity?
I think you just broke my brain. What would that be?
Candide wrote he was a satirist in France back in the day, but he used to criticize people who saw everything as good because it existed. Because clearly there are some things that when we see it happen, like a murder or a rape, a crime against humanity, a genocide, we see that as generally being pretty bad. How can you say that that's good, right?
Yeah, well, again, I guess what I'm saying, the problem there is you have to dissociate the judgments from the events and from the facts of life itself, and you have to realize that the meaning is maintained in like how you interpret, like, because basically there's no changing that. So like judging that as bad is not going to benefit you. It's not going to get you anything good. So
judging something as bad is the opposite of accepting it.
Right. And so you have to accept it, and you basically have to look at what's the most positive but the most positive like reaction I can give to that. So how can I utilize that to make myself better?
Right.
And that doesn't take away from the fact that it might cause certain adversity and all that sort of thing. And it could be that the way to make society better could involve consequences for whoever did that, right? It's not precluding the fact that there needs to be justice and that sort of thing.
Right, exactly. And that's a good point. I think justice is it's so interesting, justice. I mean, I kind of almost want to do a whole another podcast on the topic of what is justice.
Yeah, we've touched on like morality and ethics just barely, but maybe we should dig in deeper on some of that.
Yeah. But I guess to tie that justice loosely into what we're talking about now, it's an injustice to to yourself to look at whatever situation you're in through the lens of this is awful. I mean, it's okay to acknowledge and accept the challenge that's in front of you, but without a judgment. And so
it's kind of like the difference between failing and failure.
Yes.
So you can fail, you can like not achieve what you set out to achieve. That does not necessarily make you into a failure. When you associate that as being like an attribute of yourself, that is like the first step in a downward spiral / negative feedback loop, right? So that's kind of the first step to like overcoming adversity is it's not exactly relabeling it, but it's contextualizing it correctly.
Right. I want to go back to the addict stuff, the 12-step AA rules, because one of their first steps is for you to admit that you are an addict.
Yeah.
Which is a lot closer to saying that I'm a failure rather than saying I'm failing. You know, I'm addicting. People don't say I'm addicting right now, but they say, I'm using right now. I'm in my addiction.
Yeah.
But one of the things I always struggled with the 12-step program, and nothing against anybody who's benefited from it, by the way, I think it's a great program that's helped many people. But for someone like me who thinks about philosophy and overthinks too much, one of the things I had a hard time getting around the fact was you are saying that I am followed by an absolute judgment.
Yeah.
And those tend to be permanent. So if you tend to just be very careful with I am and then whatever follows after.
Very much so. I think we got to wrap it up there.
All right. That was Olympian Method, a pretty personal podcast. Wolf, thanks for sharing. I know it's not easy for you. It's not easy for me. It's not easy for a lot of people out there, but thanks for having the courage to share. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. I appreciate you setting this up. Thank you.
Absolutely. Until next time.
Bye.